Chau, and Pablo, Lazo, and Briones. So someone from the US, someone from Canada, and someone from Mexico. As I say, jokingly, the NAFTA countries, although this is nothing to do with that. But we're sort of enacting this intercultural dialogue. The first speaker is Barbieri, and he is an associate professor at the School of Theology and Religious Studies and director of Religion and Culture program at the Catholic University of America. He's published The Ethics of Citizenship, Immigration, Group Rights in Germany, and many other articles. He works carefully in this area, and he's working on a monograph entitled Constitutive Justice and Examination of the Problem of how to develop and defend just criteria for inclusion and exclusion from political communities. He's also editing a volume on the history of just war discourse and leading a research project on post-secularity phase of the public sphere. So he'll be speaking now. We have different aspects of Charles Taylor's work. He's the first one, so I'll let him speak, and then I'll introduce the other two speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll use the podium. I like that the NAFTA countries here. There is a division of labor, I think, in our panel, at least in the conception of the panel, in that we had speakers invited from Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. I guess that means I'm supposed to address the American Charles Taylor. He's the nice Charles Taylor. I'll wander into some comments about the Canadian Charles Taylor as well. And if you think that there's no difference between the two, I would point out that one of his books, the Ethics of Authenticity, as it's known to most Americans, that's the optimistic title. The Canadian version was originally called The Malaise of Modernity. That was the dark Charles Taylor. I want to offer, before I launch into my remarks, a special thanks to Peter Casarella for this invitation today, not just because it's a wonderful opportunity to get acquainted with the activities of his center here, but also because it's provided me with the opportunity to bring together my research group that was mentioned in the introduction. It's working on the implications of some of Charles Taylor's work for the future of the activity of faith communities in the public sphere. And we will be having a meeting here later this week. Peter is welcome to make that possible, so thanks again to you. My remarks are called The Moral Imagination and Intercultural Understanding, a Contribution of Charles Taylor. In a recent appreciation of Jürgen Habermas on the occasion of his 80th birthday, Charles Taylor singled out for praise three facets of the German philosopher's work. Number one, his innovative dialogical ethical theory. Number two, his broader philosophical theory of modernity. And three, his activities as a public intellectual. Now, later this year, when Taylor himself turns 80 in November, I think someone might just end up recycling his own speech about Habermas. After all, Taylor, in a parallel fashion, has, number one, made his philosophical mark, with some insightful interventions on the character of agency and sociality. Number two, he's built these into a very powerful account of the intellectual and spiritual dynamics of modernity. And three, he's striven to put theory into practice as a figure in Canadian politics and public life. And he's not done there either. In fact, he's spent most of this year to date in India, exploring alternative models of secularization and modernity. So he's branching out into a broader cultural nexus. When he turns 100, inshallah, as they say, we may need to expand the laudation to include his signal contribution to comparative philosophy and intercultural understanding. Hopefully that book will come in at under 1,000 pages. This is all not to imply that these are new concerns with him, intercultural relations and understanding. To the contrary, over his career, he's had a good deal to say here and there about the hermeneutics and ethics of intercultural encounters. In my remarks, I want to trace how certain building blocks of Taylor's approach to intercultural dialogue have emerged through different facets and phases of his work, including his early work on agency, his grand accounts of modern identity and secularity, and his forays into public life. Time permitting, I'll pause to identify one particular problem that attends his treatment so far, before wrapping up with a few observations about the philosophical and theological leitmotif that his work evinces. Now, As I say, if it's premature to attribute to Taylor a full-fledged normative theory of intercultural relations, he's nonetheless had a good deal to say over the years that bears on this topic, from his early essays on philosophical anthropology, through his writings on Hegel, on multiculturalism, on the modern self, sources of the self, and more recently on social imaginaries and secularity. And let's not forget his recent co-authored report on religious accommodation in Quebec that came out a couple of years ago. Now, as key building blocks of his view, we can consider, one, his conception of sociality and, I would add to that, collective agency. Number two, his appropriation of Gadamer's Hermeneutics as a model of cross-cultural understanding. Three, his development of Hegel's notion of recognition. Four, his theory of social imaginaries. And finally, five, his grand narrative, and he's not shy to call it that, of the arc of Western secular modernity. I'll say something brief about each one of these five particulars. To my mind, Taylor's most perceptive and important philosophical work is to be found among his early writings on agency, language, and the character of the human sciences. Writing against behaviorist modes of explanation of human conduct, Taylor provided a nuanced and perceptive account of the central role of interpretation and understanding in human agency, carving out along the way key places for culture and language in his philosophical anthropology. In vanquishing narrowly instrumental and cognitivist views of rationality and action, he drew attention to the crucial epistemological roles of the tacit background of practical action. He was influenced here by Michael Polanyi, among others, and the social or communal grounding of agency. So, language, community, culture, and what we might call habitus. These became hallmarks of Taylor's perspective and have operated as chief themes in his periodic reflections on intercultural comparison and dialogue since. I'm going to skip over here a brief section where I talk about some of the other key influences in the early phase of his work. Hegel would be one, of course. Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder, is particularly important here because of his sense of the authenticity and originality of peoples. We could also mention here Weber, Durkheim, Karl Jasper's theory of the axial age, which gives to Taylor a conception of world religions as somehow bound together. Finally, I mentioned Taylor's status as a communitarian, his reputation for launching critiques of atomistic human behavior. His communitarianism reflects his emphasis on culture in this work. We can pause here and acknowledge that Taylor has not always been rigorously attentive to the limits of the language of cultures. At times he seems to speak as if cultures are both highly integrated and more or less homogeneous, when in actuality, of course, they tend to be messily demarcated and they're always in flux. They have internal diversity and tensions and are readily subject to reification and misrepresentation. It's also the case that Taylor's focus has been almost exclusively on the modern West and its native modes of subjectivity, selfhood, and identity, and his philosophical history, therefore, has strong limitations. Of course, he's well aware of these criticisms and has recognized the need to acknowledge that there are both multiple modernities and alternative modernities following different thinkers there. And that we may at best have to rely on something like Weber's ideal types in trying to characterize the distinctive features of cultures without getting into all the details. Moving on, the next building block in Taylor's approach to intercultural understanding is his use of the social imaginary as a way of characterizing the background understanding or world picture that informs and conditions societies or cultures and their actions. Multiple modernities, Taylor says, are accompanied by multiple social imaginaries. Indeed, he develops a historiography whereby certain ideas gradually embed themselves, produce institutions and practices, and spread within a population in the form, eventually, of unexamined assumptions about the world. What exactly is a social imaginary for Taylor? At first, he's coy on this question. He says it's, quote, not a set of ideas, it's more basically what enables, through making sense of, the practices of a society. Now that's still pretty vague. Eventually he specifies that a social imaginary is a background, an inchoate and implicit orientation in or of social space that carries with it understandings of, quote, how we stand in relationship to one another, how we got where we are, how we relate to other groups. This is the level at which Taylor examines what he calls the conditions of belief. It's a Vorgriff, to use the German term, a shared layer of perception that carries with it a repertoire of collective actions of which it makes sense. Chief among the components of the social imaginary is a conception of moral order, which varies from civilization to civilization and can shift significantly over time. Much of Taylor's recent work charts the emergence of the social imaginary operative in the modern West, which, in his telling, replaced older imaginaries infused by natural law or cosmic hierarchy, with a new landscape privileging the notion of an order, what he calls an order of mutual benefit, and marked by distinctive and new social features imagined as part of social imaginary, such as markets, the public sphere, politics, our modern sense of politics is part of the social imaginary for Taylor, peoples, societies, individuals, and include their sovereignty. These features, we should note, are not fixed. For Taylor, they can mutate or confront radically different or alien conceptions of human relations to each other, to power, to time, to law, to land. Now, what happens when there's a clash of cultures or of social imaginaries? This is one juncture at which Taylor is called upon to work through the issue of intercultural dialogue. One place where he's taken on this topic is his well-known essay on multiculturalism, the politics of recognition. You'll hear more about that from Carolyn. But there he weighs in on the issues of identity politics that dominated the 80s and early 90s. Because identities always develop dialogically, Taylor notes, whether and how recognition of one's or one's group's identity is given or withheld is crucial to human well-being. Rooting his discussion in Hegel's classic treatment of the master-slave relation, Taylor argues the dynamics of recognition, how we address other cultures, constitutes a critical determinant of equality, freedom, and authenticity in modern societies. He then proposes an ethics of dialogue with several components to it. The first is a presumption that any culture is due the respect that we accord our own, a presumption of mutual respect. This respect, which Taylor says presupposes, requires something like an act of faith, is qualified. It's due only to comprehensive cultures of good standing, not just to anything that calls itself a culture. And it's due presumptively, meaning that it can be withdrawn if suitable warrants arise. Such warrants can be based only on judgments that arise from genuine attempts at understanding that not only acknowledge the otherness of different cultures, but also recognize the limits of our own categories and standards of evaluation. We can compare cultures only through a hermeneutical process in which we strive to attain what Gadamer famously called a fusion of horizons that expands our own background to valuation. That's the term that Taylor uses, something like the social imaginary, through an encounter with the unfamiliar. This undertaking exceeds the limits of our normal language of understanding and of theirs, and requires the creation of what Taylor calls a language of perspicuous contrast, in which, quote, the possible human variation would be so formulated that both our form of life and theirs could be perspicuously described as alternative such variations. In this process, we transform our own standards for appreciating the worth of other cultures. Taylor comments, real judgments of worth suppose a fused horizon of standards. They suppose that we've been transformed by the study of the other so that we are not simply judging by our original familiar standards. A favorable judgment made prematurely would not only be condescending, but ethnocentric. It would praise the other for being like us. Taylor says we need to be genuinely open to the possibility that the contrast with another society or culture might show our own language of understanding to be distorted or inadequate, and thus inferior. In some, he warns equally against the relativist assumption that other cultures are all equal and beyond criticism, and the harmful illusion of our own, either scientific or religious, infallibility. And he insists that the genuine attempt to understand other societies ought to alter our own self-understanding. Now, his musings on this topic are not entirely academic, and I'll say here a word about his foray into Canadian public policy in a report that he issued a couple of years ago on cultural relations in Quebec. If the concerns he addressed in the 1990s were symbolized by, as he said in Cinema Multiculturalism, the figure of Shakespeare's Caliban as the epitome of the lack of recognition of New World indigenous peoples, in the last decade it's rather been the Taliban who stood for the neuralgic issues attending cultural and religious diversity in North American and North Atlantic societies. The report, the Taylor-Bouchard report, commissioned following a period of particularly intense objections to religious practices associated with immigrants, took up as its charge assessing the situation and providing recommendations regarding issues of accommodation related to religious differences, to cultural differences in Quebec. Taylor's hand is apparent in the document's detailed discussion of what they call interculturalism, a model distinct from Canadian multiculturalism, representing, quote, a way of promoting ethnocultural relations characterized by interaction in a spirit of respect for differences. That should sound familiar. So features of this model are, one, its understanding of integration as a sort of contract in which respect for certain basic goods, Quebec nationality, learning French, and so on, earns migrants acceptance and the protection of their rights. A second component of this model is its encouragement of plurilingualism and multiple identities among citizens. And thirdly, its insistence, it has an insistence that members of the majority culture, in this case Francophone Quebecers, accept that their culture will be transformed over time through interaction with newcomers. A last striking feature of the Taylor-Bouchard report, finally, is its insistence that cultural, and in particular religious differences, need not be confined to the private domain. To the contrary, they must be freely displayed in public life. This statement reflects the position that Taylor has defended in a running debate over the years with John Rawls, Habermas, and others regarding the proper role for expressions of religious conviction in public, political, legislative, and even constitutional debates. Even though the late Rawls, and more recently Habermas, in his talk of the post-secular society, have come some way in granting legitimacy to religiously backed utterances in public debate, they fall short of the level of inclusivity championed by Taylor. And it's here that a tension arises in Taylor's thought that I think requires further reflection, having to do with the issue of whether, for public purposes, religion should be thought of as deeply distinctive from other modes of thought and reason. For Taylor seems here to want to have it both ways. On the one hand, he's devoted much of his magnum opus, A Secular Age, to defending the proposition that in spite of the progression of various forms of secularization, the pursuit of human fullness depends ultimately on conforming our lives to the demands of a transcendent reality that he recognizes as the God of Abraham. The transcendent ground of religion is thus categorically different from the immanent frame characterizing modern secular societies, and to be a believer sets one apart in a fundamental way from one's secular counterparts. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the public realm, as we've seen, Taylor wants to say that a religious outlook should not be excluded from political deliberation any more than competing philosophical views, say Kantianism or utilitarianism, but should rather be regarded as on all fours with other worldviews. In a recent exchange with Habermas last year, he insisted vociferously that there's no epistemological divide between secular and religious reason. So, is religion special, or is it assimilable to other philosophical or cultural outlooks? An answer has implications ranging from public policy questions to theological debates. Though I don't have time to pursue the question today, I would say that Taylor's still chewing on this issue. It recognizes that both his immanence transcendence language that he uses in A Secular Age and the dichotomy of secular and religious that he also relies on are imperfect tools for his purposes, ultimately. Well, to wrap things up, to return for a moment to the Taylor-Bouchard report. The document names its approach to the question of accommodation integrative pluralism. There's a sense in which this term captures not only the lineaments of Taylor's approach to intercultural relations, but serves as the leitmotif of his entire philosophy. As Craig Calhoun has remarked, Taylor, quote, remains enduringly engaged with the idea of a differentiated, pluriform whole. And this is an idea that he takes up in Hegel and Herder, and that crops up again and again in his work. One sees it, for example, in the vision presented in his lecture on a Catholic modernity, of the oneness of plural, irreducibly different human lives resulting from the reconciliation brought about by the dynamics of incarnation and redemption. We encounter the theme of Catholicity as unity across difference, again in the negative portrayal in a secular age, of the way in which what Taylor calls the urge to reform within Christianity has homogenized and thus mutilated, he says, the faith by failing to respect the integrity of different ways of being faithful. The church, says Taylor, was meant to be the place in which human beings, in all their difference and disparate itineraries, come together. Taylor's understanding of multiple modernities also partakes of this motif of plurality dialectically unified into a whole. And the same can be said of his conception of democracy, in which, as I've noted, religious viewpoints are invited into the public sphere to interact on equal terms with other sorts of what he calls, borrowing from Rawls, comprehensive worldviews. In describing the product, Taylor drops Gadamer's fusion of horizons image in favor of Rawls's notion of an overlapping consensus. Lastly, I would add Taylor's grand narrative of the dance of immanence and transcendence in a secular age follows this pattern, inasmuch as he seems to believe that there is a historical dynamic in which different societies will swing back and forth between different fragile points of equilibrium, such that more or less immanentized, we could even say, secularized societies will eventually, ineluctably, give way to spiritual searching and a quest to, as he put it not long ago, make belief believable again. This is what Taylor sees in his own dialectic of history. And investigating this dynamic has taken him to India, as I mentioned. After that, I would say, and I had a conversation with him about this, China beckons as the next great frontier. And we can hope that down the line we'll be privileged with another typically rich Taylorian ethics of intercultural exchange and comparative social imaginary. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Anyway, thank you for your attention.
I think it's best to have all the speakers present, and then it's my challenge to you listening. Try to think of a question that will connect all of the talks. Because when we start to do discussions after each talk, then we run out of time. So I will now present the second speaker. It's Carolyn Chau. She's working right now on a dissertation on Taylor's work, and her research interests include development. And she's doing that at Regis College in Canada. So she's our Canadian representative. Research interests include the development of secularity in the West, emerging forms of faith community and fitness, ethics, philosophy, and philosophy of religion. And, she has a publication forthcoming in the journal Modern Theology, and she's the recipient of the Fellowship in Social Sciences in the Humanities Research Council of Canada. So we're very happy to have you here. And now another perspective on Taylor's work. Thanks for being here.
Without being too impressive, I was wondering if the panelists could gather at the table.
Sure.
Yeah. It feels more communal or something.
Okay.
I was at a conference.
We've got your back.
Well, briefly didn't go to the light was on before, but
Yeah,
okay. That would be interesting. Yeah. Communitarian.
You think there's safety in numbers?
Something like that. Exactly. No, I don't need to. The question is not safety. The question is community. Anyway, thank you so much for this opportunity, Dr. Tezzarella, and the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. It's just been amazing to just meet everyone. I've met people from Spain, Italy, Uganda, Canada, and there's a way in which just the meeting itself, being embodied, is a sense of that global and local. So it's a real blessing. So particularity, holes, and Catholicity today, that's what I'd like to discuss. A version away of talking about Taylor's sense of what it means to be global, what it means to be Catholic. There might be repetition, but maybe there will be a fusion within that repetition. Charles Taylor's work in social and political philosophy has continually aimed to achieve a balance between the recognition of difference and the importance of unity within a polity. His accounts of social cohesion amidst difference in political theory are premised on an anthropology which underscores recognition of persons as agents, as self-interpreting animals, and culture as an identity-constituting horizon. Taylor's fundamental interest in processes of reconciliation has crystallized over the years into a belief that unity happens most effectively through encounter and dialogue. His reflections on unity and diversity have led more recently to explicit consideration of Catholicity, faith in the West, and the situation of Latin Christianity. Clearly, there are myriad ways in which Taylor's work offers the kind of foundations for theology of intercultural dialogue that in turn may illuminate the emerging discourse of Catholicity. In this presentation, I will explore Taylor's contribution to intercultural hermeneutics through a consideration of three aspects of his thought: his cultural account of secularity, his politics of recognition, and his vision of Catholicity today. Some key steps toward developing a more intercultural approach to Catholicity, I believe, include the recognition of the particularity of one's own cultural narrative of faith, the belief that wholeness and integration is achieved through a basic assumption of value in other cultures, and a persistent faith in the possibility of reconciliation through attention to its ongoing incarnation in history. I believe that Taylor's articulation of a culturally particular narrative of faith experience, his sense that recognition is most authentically given and received through cultural interaction, and emphasis on the need for a diversity of Catholic expression for a fullness of faith, affect precisely these movements toward a renewed understanding of Catholicity for our time. So I turn first to Taylor's culturally specific theory of secularity. Taylor's method of narrating secularization is both a cultural theory of modernity and a culturally located theory of modernity. Taylor limits his study to what he terms the North Atlantic West, based on this notion that modernity and secularity are not univocal phenomena that replicate themselves in a well-established order of development. While modernity has unfolded in the West in a certain manner, such that the context of faith shifts from being one in which belief in God was only one option, to one where faith in God is one option among many, modernity and the transformation of faith may happen in other ways for other cultures. This approach to elucidating secularity reveals Taylor's sense that culture and cultural shifts contextualize in an ongoing way the experience of faith. It highlights that Taylor attempts only to deepen the self-understanding of the spiritual situation in Western culture. Taylor's narrative of modern secularity in Western cultures involves certain particular moments. Persons living in the Western world 500 years ago experienced the universe as enchanted. Gradually unmoored from a cosmos with its bride meanings, they found themselves moving into a deistic conception of God that ultimately led to a sense that freedom comes only in choosing, and thus our sense of self is reduced to this ability to choose. Along the way, a key shift in cultural ethos was the affirmation of ordinary life, through which the ideal of companionate marriage, more explicit sanctification of family life, and values of production came to the fore. The ethic of authenticity, too, arose as part of a response to a universe that was no longer enchanted. It was the historical outcome of an age in which persons were mobilized and constricted to reconstruct the universe after its disenchantment. Today, while belief in transcendence is still possible, we, in the North Atlantic West, Taylor says, experience faith in a fragilized and cross-pressured way due to the frontal attacks of Nietzschean denials of transcendence and the exclusive focus on immanence by secular humanists. I guess, rhyme this off in a sing-song way because I think part of Taylor's effectiveness at telling this story is that I'm assuming many of us are now already familiar with it. And so I just want to flag up the fact that in itself, Taylor's way of engaging is already cultural and not merely theoretical in an exclusive way. The background assumption of Taylor's exploration of the conditions for belief today underscores that culture and religious faith are mutually implicating, even more so than previously conceived. A secular age highlights that debating religious beliefs in a propositional form is not the most fruitful way to engage in discourse about religion, or not a fruitful way at all, Taylor would say, because the conditions with which people today receive propositional claims of faith are affected by numerous shifts in the social imaginary of Western culture over centuries. Stances of belief and unbelief today have a complicated, normatively inflected history. Importantly, Taylor reads each shift as being attended by a moral motivation. In noting that moral motivations underlie all the narratival shifts in social imaginary, Taylor demonstrates the significance of the ethical plane for the engagement between church and culture. At the same time, Taylor notes that moral motives in any age are never as easily discernible as simply good or vicious, in one way or the other, since the norms change without and within an ever-evolving framing social imaginary. Taylor's sensitivity to moral motivation and awareness of the relatively deft hands of time on framing norms emerge in his qualified judgment, for example, on the age of authenticity. It highlights Taylor's understanding of the interpenetration of culture, faith, and ethics. And I want to quote it in full because I think it just shows really his sense of discernment and charity. I think we need to allow a similar double assessment in a term like that which inaugurates the age of authenticity. It is tempting for those out of sympathy with this term to see it simply in light of its illusions, to see authenticity or the affirmation of sensuality as simply egoism and the pursuit of pleasure, for example, or to see the aspiration to self-expression exclusively in the light of consumer choice. It is tempting, on the other side, for proponents of the term to affirm the values of the new ideal as though they were unproblematic, cost-free, and could never be trivialized. Both see the term as move within a stable, perennial game. For the critics, it involves the embracing of vices which were and are the main threats to virtue. For the boosters, we have reversed age-old forms which were and are modes of oppression. I want to view the term differently. When we undergo some such transformation, the moral states change. I don't mean that we cannot make a reasoned overall judgment about the gains and losses in the transition. I believe that this one has been, on balance, positive, while involving palpable costs. But I do mean that the available options have changed. This means, first, that some options available in earlier days are not possible today, like a general return to the ideal of clear and fixed gender roles in the family. And secondly, it means that there are options today within the new context, and that some of them are better than others. This is something which the constant harping on the most degraded forms by critics tends to include. The critics become unwitting allies of the trivialized forms because they attack the new context as a whole, as though it were defined by these. That one side in the abortion debate calls itself pro-choice has something to do with the dynamic of its battle with its polar opposite. Root and branch attacks on authenticity help to make our lives worse, while being powerless to put the clock back to an earlier time. End quote. Excuse me. Taylor's assessment of the age of authenticity reveals the way in which his cultural narrative method of narrating modern secularity proceeds on the basis of a hermeneutic of charity towards modernity and secular society, weaving critique of Western individualism with affirmation of ever greater contemporary expressions of goodwill. He recognizes the shifting character of ethics on the ground and reads history with an eye to seeing within it the pursuit of the good, if not the fulfillment of it. By using the concept of the social imaginary to develop an historical narrative of Western culture, he applies the profound Augustinian insight that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every soul. This seems to be a guiding insight that Taylor inscribes in this narrative of modern secularity. As D. Stephen Long notes, Taylor consistently opposes, and as Professor Barbieri has also noted, Taylor consistently opposes a reformed imposition of an ethic wherever he sees it. The strongest and most consistent evaluation in the secular age is his opposition to a disciplined society in which categorical relations have primacy and therefore norms. Yet even here, Taylor balances this negative valuation, Long notes, by recognizing it is not pure evil. But nevertheless, it all started as a laudable attempt to fight back the demands of the world and then make it over. Taylor's treatment of religious belief by way of analyzing the cultural shifts in the modern social imaginary assists the church and culture in reconceptualizing the degree to which their relationship with one another is mutually implicating and morally complex. His description of the church's relationship with culture may ultimately show its greatest merit as a complement to another way of configuring the church-culture engagement, for example, that of William Kavanaugh or David Schindler. And here I am very appreciative of what Professor Schreider has said about attempting that reconciliation between communio and concilium. Nonetheless, Taylor's account of the mutually enmeshed relationship between church and culture is significant for a renewed understanding of culture and Catholicity. So I turn now to Taylor's understanding that goals are best achieved through recognition through a faith-based presumption of value, leading to intercultural experience. Taylor believes that the best approach to claims to recognition of value within a politics of equal recognition is a presumption of the equal value of another culture. Taylor's solution is notable for the way in which it gives rise to an openness to encounter with another culture and a willingness to study it, the way it opens up a space for engagement and integration, and the manner in which it resituates the discourse about the recognition of difference from law to culture or citizenship. Taylor contends that to legislate recognition of the equal value of another culture, in certain cases, actually short-circuits the possibility of truly discerning another culture's value, as one cannot truly understand another culture's value prior to a trust, I argue, that opens one up to the experience of learning about the other. Following Gadamer, Taylor underscores the importance of dialogical encounter for an enriched understanding. A fusion of horizons may occur and our original starting point change in light of encountering the other. Taylor's proposal of a presumption of equal value also shifts the liberal challenge of negotiating unity and diversity onto the ground of spirituality. That is perhaps the most interesting aspect of Taylor's solution to the dilemma arising from identity politics and liberalism with equal rights. It not only avoids the extremes of inauthentic and homogenizing demands for recognition and ethnocentrism, as Taylor claims, but the presumption underscores that recognition and reconciliation is based on faith and hope that gives rise to an encounter. Taylor's approach of faith giving rise to understanding shows the importance of openness to the other to truly appreciate the worth of the other culture. He cites Herder's vision of divine providence, according to which all this variety of culture was not a mere accident, but was meant to bring about a greater harmony, as one such example of what I want to underscore, a spiritual vision that supports the value of respect of other cultures. Where value in other cultures is concerned, Taylor favors dialogue between cultures rather than a legislated prima facie right to equal recognition, an encounter between citizens rather than peace effected through the law. There's something important in shifting the issue from law to one of spirit. As Habermas notes in his response piece to Taylor on politics of recognition, as soon as we treat a problem as a legal problem, we bring into play a conception of modern law that forces us, on conceptual grounds alone, to operate with the architectonics of the constitutional state and its wealth of presuppositions. This has implications for the way we deal with the problem of securing equal legal rights and equal recognition for groups that are culturally defined. That is, collectivities that are distinguished from other collectivities on the basis of tradition, forms of life, ethnic origins, and so on, and whose members want to be distinguished from all other collectivities in order to maintain and develop their identity. This, of course, is where Habermas is engaging Taylor on the question of respect rather than value. But it's interesting because it also highlights that Taylor himself in that essay has two different approaches, and I want to focus on his move to that cultural approach when it comes to value. This is exactly right, and it seems that Taylor's solution is one that moves away from procedural reconciliation to cultural reconciliation. Taylor's emphasis on the presumption of the value of another culture is an attempt to avoid the homogenization that he sees in a strictly legal solution. Taylor explicitly rejects the legal route of adjudicating difference and legislating a prima facie positive judgment in favor of a willingness to enter a process of learning and becoming changed through dialogue. Taylor wants to focus on the encounter with diversity through dialogue, as Rowan Williams notes, and I think he's closer to Taylor in noting the importance of the shared dialogue and encounter form, closer in his interpretation. Taylor's position saves us from the undesirable consequences arising from tolerance for its own sake. He allows that one can even end up with a negative evaluation of a culture that emerges from a genuine exploration and engagement of it. The move away from law to civic and cultural engagement is also evident in Taylor's affirmation of concerted adjustment in his policy piece for Quebec of 2008. Taylor recognizes that the realm of reconciliation and true integration happens on the ground in the space of living together. Hence, he recommends where possible, in schools, hospitals, workplaces, and public spaces in general, where no undue hardship is incurred or rights violated, reasonable accommodation, policy originating from the sphere of labor he goes into, should be the policy adopted. Moreover, concerted adjustment, which occurs between citizens rather than through the courts, is endorsed even more strongly than reasonable accommodation. Law can facilitate encounter with the other, of course. Taylor acknowledges the tendency toward homogeneity that's inscribed in democracies by virtue of the need for social bonds to be strong among a self-determining people, which relies on no outside source for their unity. In the same work on accommodation, Taylor finds a more spacious way of dealing with difference through recommending the ethos of interculturalism to be fixed in policy. As stated in his commission report on reasonable accommodation, in the case of interculturalism, it is a question of reconciling the imperatives of pluralism stemming from the growing diversification of our society and the necessary integration of a small nation that constitutes a cultural minority in North America. This is ultimately parsed into 5 general criteria to guide a proposal to the government on the meaning of interculturalism as a norm for Quebec society. French is the common language of intercultural dialogue in Quebec, cultivation of an orientation toward pluralism that is sensitive and protective of individual rights, preservation of the tension between diversity and social cohesion through the continuity of the French-speaking core, an emphasis on integration, and an endorsement of interaction. The ethos of interculturalism thus serves as another reminder by Taylor of the way that integration of a political whole involves interaction of the cultures that comprise that society. I want to underscore again that Taylor's appropriation of Gadamerine hermeneutic dialogue and its belief in the potentially rich experience of fusion of horizons really includes that aspect of this hermeneutic which can be described best as a faith and a hope. These are theological grounds, then, for a kind of relationship between cultures, where people worry about Taylor's homogenizing tendency and its roots in a too rosy picture of ontological reconciliation or politics of the good. I seek to describe Taylor's work on recognition in its resistance to systematizing the good of difference and a favoring of a presumption of value in the other that then leads to encounter as a gesture of hope and as a gesture of faith. Catholicity today requires a faith in wholeness through diversification. Taylor often manages to affirm a pluralism that does not reduce to an affirmation of fragmentation. Indeed, much of Taylor's work on modern malaise has been around the twin concerns of the need to recognize difference and the problem of fragmentation. Fragmentation of persons, of societies, of our very horizon of understanding, our social imaginary. Taylor's concern for fragmentation, not in a way unlikely with praise and passage to modernity, shows that he is not a difference for difference sake kind of a pluralist. Taylor's philosophical works reveal him rather to be an affirmer of diversity who nonetheless gestures to an ultimate reality that guides and drives all of our striving. Fragmentation is not the end of difference, rather difference is the condition for the possibility of a greater reconciliation. It's not surprising then that over the course of his works, Taylor increasingly turns his attention to that Catholic ethos, that Catholicity that informs him. It is traceable in Taylor's affirmation of the sovereignty of the good, for example, in Sources of the Self and our teleological orientation to the good. Taylor's Catholicism also reveals itself in certain allusions to Trinitarian and incarnational principles. Some have begun to draw this out, such as Carlos Colorado, who argues in a recent dissertation that Taylor's notion of transcendence and pluralism are rooted in his understanding of kenosis and his Catholicism. Taylor is explicit about sensing that an affirmation of plurality is written in a Christian vision of the world. Colorado reminds us that Taylor emphasizes the goodness of creation. Taylor affirms differentiation and states in Catholic modernity, no widening of the Catholica, the Church Universal, without increasing differentiation in expressions of faith. Taylor states that what is needed in a secular age is indeed a plurality of forms of spiritual expression, a diversity of spiritual itineraries toward God, new forms of Christian spirituality rather than a return to Christendom. The truth of Catholicism for Taylor is not univocal but symphonic. In this, to some extent, he follows Hans Urs Balthasar. Balthasar names more clearly, however, the criterion for discerning the authenticity of a form, whether it reveals the person of Christ and the spirit of love between Father and Son. Truth has but one form, the form of love, self-gift, but it can be expressed in many ways. And Taylor's appropriation of incarnation is apparent in his exhortation to embody the faith and encounter that is willing to give ourselves freely to the other through sharing where we are situated, where we come from, as Professor Catalble has very clearly delineated this point. It has been observed that Taylor might be overly cultural in his analysis of difference, or too liberal with some of the problems with relativism arising from pluralism that attend this issue. Of course, the challenges between the liberal and Christian paradigms of life have been greatly elucidated by a number of contemporary Christian, perhaps neo-Augustinian theologians. I genuinely appreciate Dr. Havanaugh's articulation of the difference between Catholicity mediated by the state, for example, and the Catholicity mediated by the Church in, through, and with Christ. Here, then, is where we might ask if Taylor's drive to reconciliation might not finally receive its full freedom from tendencies of homogenization, of difference and totalization, through an emphasis on the vision of unity and difference that is found in an attitude of faith and hope in the Catholicity of God's Word. Thus, to sum up, Taylor contributes to the theoretical foundation for intercultural dialogue with his articulation of a consciously particular narrative of modernity and secularity and a cultural understanding of modernity. In addressing the political question of recognition of value of another culture, he elaborates that a presumption of equal value, rooted in faith and culminating in openness to study of the other, makes wholes possible, whole cultures and whole persons. His ethos of interculturalism also brings out the need to encounter and engage cultural others for integration. And finally, Taylor's sense of the need of Catholicity today to exemplify diversity in its spiritual expression paves the way for a clear signal of the importance of dialogue between cultures for a true Catholicity of the Church in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker, and it's a special pleasure because Peter and Esther and I met Pablo when we went to the University of Iberoamericana, which we're trying to put up an exchange program with between the fall and that university. So we're very grateful that you came here this time. We enjoyed our visit there very much. Thanks to your hospitality. Pablo is a professor and researcher in the Department of Philosophy, and he's also the coordinator of postgraduate studies there. So just like our program, we have an undergraduate and graduate program in philosophy. So we're actually a nice match because a lot of the faculty at Pablo's University share a lot of the interests and work that you do in our department. So very good. Pablo has done a lot of work on Charles Taylor. He's published several books, one in Spanish, and actually he's going to give his talk in Spanish, but he's doing a PowerPoint on he's written on the relationship between philosophy and literature, and published a book on the Hermeneutics of Charles Taylor, Interpretation of Action in Spanish, and his third book is a critique of the critics of multiculturalism, resignification of multiculturalism. Again, the PowerPoint is going to be in English or
yes, both.
Okay, both, right. We thought it would be nice to have, I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is make Spanish more of a presence, and since this is a discussion of interculture. That makes sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a copy.
Oh, we have a copy of the papers. Do we have copies of them?
Yes, I have copies of this.
Definitely a copy. Yeah. I have a copy of it now in English. This is the translation of the talk.
Thank you.
We'll check the translation. I'll hold this in case. I can do this. Yeah. Okay. Oh. It's the same. I thought it was It's the same. No, it's the same. Is that coming up, Pablo?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, let me just go to.
Well, thank you very much for this challenging presentation in Spanish, but I think it's a very good idea to enforce and to strengthen our intercultural perspective of this colony. I have titled my presentation Secularización y Creencia, un caso mexicano visto desde la perspectiva tayloriana. You'll have it in English. En esta ocasión, me gustaría discutir la relación entre el actual fenómeno de multiplicación de opciones religiosas y la así llamada secularización, entendida como la demanda cultural y política, para decirlo en términos negativos, de no tomar en cuenta tales opciones religiosas cuando están implicados asuntos públicos. Siguiendo argumentos de A Secular Age, del filósofo canadiense Charles Taylor, intentaré dar una respuesta a las siguientes preguntas. ¿Qué supone el contraste entre un fenómeno social de multiplicación de las creencias cuando se opone a la tendencia política de la no creencia? Y sobre todo, ¿en qué manera este contraste puede ser entendido desde una perspectiva latinoamericana? O para ser más precisos, desde la perspectiva religiosa intercultural del pueblo celtal en Chiapas, México. La propuesta hermenéutica de Charles Taylor, en lo que toca a sus repercusiones prácticas, nos puede dar una indicación para contestar a estas preguntas. La acción en el terreno social y político está configurada por la necesidad de un reconocimiento entre los distintos actores sociales, reconocimiento que tiene que ver directamente, por un lado, con el despliegue de la identidad ética y cultural que los constituye como tales, y por otro lado, con la perspectiva de un trato incluyente y tolerante en el espacio de diversificación multicultural, que son la mayor parte de las sociedades contemporáneas, que funcionan con la estructura política de lo que llamamos secularización. El problema de cómo generar y mantener el reconocimiento tolerante y respetuoso entre actores sociales, sobre todo cuando estos tienen diversas creencias, viene a complicarse por la peculiar situación por la que atraviesan nuestras sociedades actuales, el fenómeno masivo de inmigración y otras movilizaciones poblacionales en el marco internacional, así como las concomitantes demandas de derechos por parte de cada vez más grupos minoritarios, que cobrando conciencia del carácter diferencial de las prácticas que los constituyen, se organizan civilmente para asegurar su promoción y su protección y promoción. De modo que tenemos múltiples creencias religiosas en contra, en esta primera perspectiva, en contra de la secularización política. Aquí sostendremos que esta insistencia por asegurar no solo la libre elección de la forma de vida de los individuos en comunidad desde un enfoque liberal, sino también la protección y garantía de las formas de vida culturales ya existentes, heredadas dentro de un marco cultural concreto, desde un enfoque comunitarista, solo es posible si se adoptan una serie de orientaciones ético-hermenéuticas que incidan sobre las decisiones políticas y sobre los marcos jurídicos que regulan las relaciones entre grupos e individuos. Con esta última aseveración, queremos seguir el intento de mediación entre la postura liberal y la comunitaria, extremas, ideado por Charles Taylor, esto es, su propuesta de mesurar cada postura rescatando lo mejor de ellas. Y creemos que el caso de la religiosidad de los celtales es un buen ejemplo de tal reconocimiento a este respecto. Tengamos presente el estatus de la cosmovisión religiosa del pueblo indígena celtal. Aquí puse un mapa para ubicar dónde están los celtales, allá en Chiapas, y más concretamente en esta parte de Chiapas. Tengamos presente el estatus de la cosmovisión religiosa del pueblo indígena celtal y su transformación de cara a las demandas de secularismo de las instituciones públicas en México. Con esta finalidad, adoptemos la perspectiva de la antropología filosófica para enfatizar la estructura simbólica de la cosmovisión cultural de los celtales y la perspectiva ética y política para apuntar los modos en que este grupo indígena ha adoptado sus prácticas rituales y políticas en los tiempos actuales, los tiempos que corren. El asunto central a ser discutido aquí es la problemática situación de las prácticas religiosas tradicionales de los celtales, comprendidas como modos holísticos de interpretación e interacción con el mundo, cuando se enfrentan con las demandas del Estado democrático mexicano, demandas que incluyen la prohibición de tratar asuntos relativos a las cosmovisiones cuando uno participa como ciudadano en los asuntos públicos. Lo que se demanda bajo esta conformación de la vida pública liberal es excluir todo asunto relativo a creencias espirituales, compromisos éticos, aspiraciones teleológicas y así sucesivamente. Enfrentados con esta situación, los celtales han adaptado de modos creativos sus formas de organización política, de tal modo que en esta han incluido su cosmovisión religiosa, en función de seguir las demandas de un Estado secular. Paradójicamente, pues han transformado radicalmente sus prácticas rituales, artísticas y religiosas. Una foto sobre esta hibridación de prácticas religiosas celtales y católicas. En lo que concierne a las cosmovisiones existentes en las comunidades de autogobierno o políticamente autónomas, podemos resumir las demandas del gobierno mexicano cuando busca reflejar y garantizar los derechos humanos en los siguientes puntos. A. Sus estructuras deben implicar una separación entre poder político y autoridad asociada a los conceptos de cosmovisión que existen usualmente, pero no exclusivamente, en las comunidades de significado en la forma de denominaciones religiosas. Este término, comunidades de significado, communities of meaning, es de Chau. B. El poder político como tal debe ser neutral respecto a cualquier concepción de cosmovisiones y debe proteger absolutamente el pluralismo cívico en las cosmovisiones. C. En principio, la protección cosmovisional del pluralismo no debe traducirse en apoyo para las comunidades de significado como tales. D. Si alguna clase de acción política es propuesta para dar algún apoyo a estas comunidades, debe ser llevado a cabo de acuerdo a los parámetros de estricta igualdad e imparcialidad. Es el enfoque liberal del asunto. Todas estas tesis son recogidas en la categoría de secularización de las instituciones públicas. Esta propuesta ha tenido importantes implicaciones para asuntos tales como estos. A. La identidad cívica de las personas, que son reconocidas como miembros de comunidades de autogobierno, no debe ser ligada a sus opciones de cosmovisión. B. Los procesos de decisión cívica y política deben seguir un procedimiento que puede ser descrito como democrático. C. Los representantes de las comunidades de significado no deben participar como tales en tales procesos. D. El poder que pueden ejercer entre aquellos que se adhieren a las comunidades de significado no debe nunca suponer coerción sobre la libertad individual. Este es el esquema contrario a lo que estoy explicando, el esquema de imperialismo de la cultura occidental, pasando por el Estado laico mexicano y encerrando en el círculo más pequeño a los celtales. Bueno, es lo contrario a la idea liberal de Estado democrático, pero es lo que actualmente ocurre en muchas partes de México. Enfrentados a estas características, debemos pues preguntar, ¿qué es una cosmovisión? De acuerdo con Charles Taylor, esta pregunta indica un problema muy importante en nuestra visión del mundo occidentalizada, debido a la cual se ha extendido un conjunto de prácticas culturales atomizadas en todos los campos de nuestras vidas. En nuestra tradición cultural, que ha heredado el punto de vista moderno de sus encuadres científicos y liberales, es común pensar y percibir los objetos del mundo, e incluso a las otras personas, de un modo desvinculado, descomprometido, como si estos objetos y las personas que tratamos diariamente fueran cosas separadas entre sí. Este es un gran problema, ya que nos ha conducido a tratar a los objetos y a las personas meramente como instrumentos o medios para nuestros propósitos, haciendo a un lado o ignorando de este modo su valor intrínseco. Siguiendo a Max Weber, Charles Taylor ha estudiado este rasgo problemático de nuestra posición global en el mundo, en Occidente, y sus consecuencias: la pérdida de un sentido holístico del mundo, el sentimiento de extrañedad en un estilo de vida individualista y racionalístico, cuyos verdaderos resultados son resumidos en el concepto genial de Weber sobre el desencanto del mundo, o en la también genial concepción nietzscheana de muerte de Dios. Podemos pensar en este fenómeno como la raíz, la base, de nuestra práctica secular, de nuestra práctica cultural de secularismo, o el modo en que insistimos en defender las instituciones políticas seculares y la entera estructura del Estado secular moderno. El desencanto del mundo puede ser pensado como una demanda de neutralidad de frente a toda suerte de variaciones de creencias culturales o de diferentes estilos de vida que pudieran ser un peligro para la democracia. Como Richard Rorty también ha defendido, un Estado secular y nuestra idea de democracia necesita poner a un lado todo asunto de última importancia, a saber, todo aquello relacionado con un punto de vista secular, incluyendo necesariamente creencias religiosas y concepciones míticas del mundo. La razón de esta necesidad es la homogeneidad requerida por los procedimientos y orden general de un Estado secular racional. Esta concepción de un conjunto de prácticas culturales atomísticas e instrumentalizadas en un mundo desencantado, nuestro mundo secular, fue también heredado hace siglos a toda Latinoamérica y, por supuesto, al Estado liberal mexicano y sus esfuerzos por homogeneizar las grandes diferencias entre grupos culturales de todas clases, y principalmente los grupos indígenas tradicionales, como el que estamos hablando en esta oportunidad, los celtales de Bachajón, Chiapas. Antes de hablar sobre la confrontación de la estructura liberal secular del Estado mexicano con la cosmovisión del pueblo celtal y los recursos utilizados por este para continuar dando sentido a sus prácticas religiosas y culturales, definamos brevemente qué es una cosmovisión. Contra la herencia de la modernidad secular, que es, como acabo de decir, una perspectiva atomística, individualista e instrumental del mundo, una cosmovisión se caracteriza por su capacidad de vincular en una liga esencial las prácticas culturales que conforman el entramado social y la interacción con los objetos del mundo. Así, cuando hemos comprendido una cosmovisión, nos encontramos en el núcleo mismo de sus hilos de significación entretejidos. Y cada uno de estos hilos es una práctica cultural. Por ejemplo, una obra de arte, una demanda política, un ritual de fertilidad o de salud en general, un relato tradicional que se refiere a los orígenes del mundo o sobre nuestro destino final después de la muerte, y así por el estilo. Entonces, en la concepción que estoy poniendo en juego, cada uno de estos hilos significantes está esencialmente conectado con todos los demás, conformando un entramado dinámico en el que el todo y la parte se copertenecen. De tal modo que transformar, alterar o cortar uno de estos hilos seguramente tiene un impacto sobre el entramado social entero o comunidad cultural. Además de estar caracterizada por este entramado de prácticas culturales, una cosmovisión se define por extenderse en cierto espacio y por un tiempo determinado. Es decir, no se expresa solo en un evento ocasional o en un conjunto de eventos ocasionales, como las formas de vestir a la moda o los modos de hablar novedosos pero efímeros o cosas por el estilo. Por el contrario, una cosmovisión permanece en el tiempo y el espacio debido a su permanente capacidad de expresar las creencias interiores de las personas y sus comportamientos. Todo lo cual hace manifiesto el entramado cultural entero de un mundo holístico o integral. Digamos en breve que una cosmovisión expresa esa ligadura colectiva permanente o sentido de trasfondo que nos une en cierta identidad como miembros de una comunidad cultural, identidad que compartimos en el tiempo y el espacio hasta que otros eventos históricos vengan a interrumpir o transformar ese género de ligadura comunal. Las prácticas religiosas, como las que describiremos más adelante hablando de los celtales, son paradigmáticamente esta clase de prácticas esenciales de una cosmovisión. Finalmente, podemos hablar de cierta cosmovisión si hemos identificado aquellas prácticas culturales de una red social que se representan a sí mismas en el imaginario social y sus productos simbólicos encarnados en el lenguaje. Este último visto desde una perspectiva amplia, es decir, hablado, escrito, incluso pictográfica o artísticamente plasmado, y utilizado de hecho en las instituciones sociales, incluyendo las de orden político. Así, una cosmovisión es la acción más práctica y al día de un imaginario social, presente o diseminada en todas nuestras prácticas colectivas, cotidianas, esenciales. Tomando en cuenta estas características esenciales de una cosmovisión, volvamos a nuestra cuestión central. ¿De qué modo los celtales han preservado y transformado su cosmovisión religiosa cultural de frente a las demandas del Estado liberal secular en México? Esta pregunta se dirige a describir los procesos de reconocimiento intercultural en donde Occidente ya no estaría absorbiendo a los celtales, sino que estaríamos en esto que Charles Taylor llama enigmatic zones, zonas enigmáticas, en donde se da el efecto intercultural entre culturas. ¿De qué modo los celtales han preservado y transformado su cosmovisión religiosa cultural de frente a las demandas del Estado liberal secular en México? Y de este modo han logrado una suerte de reconocimiento, han sufrido una total supresión o aculturación de sus vínculos más significativos como comunidad cultural unitaria. La respuesta parece ser afirmativa si pensamos en el poder del Estado como una fuerza totalmente homogeneizadora que alcanza y desactiva toda posible reacción que pudiera contrarrestarla en este esquema. En cambio, si pensamos en esto otro, diría esto: quisiera defender justo la idea opuesta. Quiero sostener que los grupos indígenas celtales, no obstante su situación económica y social precaria y en desventaja respecto a otros grupos sociales en México, han desarrollado un peculiar modo de adaptarse a las demandas de nuestro Estado liberal y de la sociedad moderna en general, sin perder su cosmovisión esencial, y que la manera de lograr esto ha sido a través de un conjunto de prácticas adaptadas a las demandas seculares y viceversa. Las demandas públicas han sido ajustadas a las prácticas culturales religiosas. Como tales, Muchas comunidades latinoamericanas están enfrentadas a esta propuesta con otras perspectivas holísticas de la dimensión cosmovisional o espiritual, que son percibidas independientemente de otras dimensiones personales y sociales. Perciben el modo liberal occidental de gobierno como extraño a su experiencia de identidad colectiva, incluso como dañino, y defienden modos de organización desde dentro de su propia comunidad. En el caso de los celtales, la estrategia para enfrentar las demandas del Estado liberal en México se han enfocado en lo que puede llamarse ajustes o reinterpretaciones culturales, principalmente localizadas en el campo de la religión. Debe entenderse desde un comienzo que la cultura celtal es predominantemente teocéntrica y que, como dice un investigador, Eugenio Mauer, es posible cubrir virtualmente todos sus aspectos tomando la religión como su eje. En las prácticas religiosas culturales de los celtales aparecen en una intersección compleja las líneas fundamentales de lo político, lo económico, lo artístico, lo mítico, lo relativo a la vida familiar y la recuperación tradicional de su propia historia, es decir, en general, lo que podemos llamar su identidad colectiva. El elemento de cohesión de estas prácticas culturales, que nos permite hablar de una cosmovisión integral, es precisamente la religión. Sus conceptos de bien y mal, los rituales de iniciación en la vida de la comunidad, el bautismo y el matrimonio, sus ritos funerarios, la administración del poder en las decisiones comunales, pero también sus usos de la magia y el chamanismo. Todo esto puede encontrarse en la legitimación de prácticas religiosas. Ahora, si observamos estas prácticas religiosas tal como son llevadas a cabo hoy día, no podemos hablar de un fenómeno de sincretismo o mezcla sin armonía del elemento indígena con lo occidental, o del contenido religioso del catolicismo con aquellos contenidos tomados como herencia de la religión pura celtal del mundo mayense, sino más bien debemos hablar de una síntesis armoniosa de los dos elementos, el catolicismo occidental y la creencia celtal, pues podemos verificar que no existe integración caótica en las prácticas culturales mismas, por ejemplo en las fiestas populares y sus rituales y en las tradiciones vivas. Claro, estas prácticas pueden llevar a enfrentamientos con el Estado secular mexicano, y más de una vez los celtales han sido castigados y han sido metidos a la cárcel, pero lo que estoy diciendo es que las prácticas culturales mismas no están en confrontación con el Estado secular. En la síntesis cultural, pero no podemos hablar tampoco, desde una perspectiva histórica, de una total aculturación indígena por la acción de los españoles, como si lo indígena hubiera desaparecido por completo o hubiera sido absorbido por la cultura dominante. En el caso de los celtales, más bien hablamos de un proceso de síntesis o fusión de dos elementos culturales, que a decir verdad, sufrieron durante siglos un proceso preparatorio de sincretismo como una acción de la actual síntesis. Siguiendo a Maurer, pues, podemos hablar de una religión católica maya o maya católica. Por cierto, esto es lo que llama Chau fusión de horizontes. En la síntesis cultural de lo religioso con lo laico, que se verifica en las comunidades celtales, se reorientan creativamente las demandas del Estado secular y de forma general el estilo de vida individualístico e instrumental de nuestra herencia moderna. La apropiación cultural de creencias católicas y su síntesis con las creencias celtales se prueba en la aplicación práctica de asuntos legales, en la solventación de disputas entre miembros de la comunidad o incluso en la jurisdicción de la tierra. Aún son utilizadas cruces, por ejemplo, para marcar la propiedad de la tierra. Incluso se ve en procesos de legitimación de las autoridades de la comunidad que se eligen internamente, independiente de las autoridades de los llamados ladinos, nosotros, ¿no?, los hombres blancos o mestizos. Un ejemplo de esta aplicación práctica nos ayudará a demostrar este proceso de síntesis creativa como respuesta a las demandas del Estado secular. Se refiere a la organización político-religiosa y del concepto de autoridad en el proceso conocido como estructura de cargos en las comunidades celtales. En el mundo celtal, uno puede hablar de autoridad como aquella función de quien provee un servicio, de quien lleva a cabo un trabajo para la comunidad. Mandar es servir para los celtales. Y cito a Maurer: precisamente aquí recae la esencia del concepto de autoridad. En su base no está la idea de ser capaz de mandar, sino de servir. Y tal servicio se lleva a cabo en nombre de la comunidad, como está claramente indicado por la expresión te magta yu yatel ai talum, es certa. Aquel quien tiene un trabajo que hacer en el pueblo, esto es, la persona que tiene un cargo. Sin embargo, solo se convierte en suprema autoridad quien ha escalado en la estructura de cargos tomados como tareas prácticas y ha probado ser capaz de dar algo a la comunidad. Solo sabe mandar quien ha sabido obedecer. El Consejo de Autoridad Supremo es llamado Principality, los principales, quienes son responsables tanto de decisiones legales y políticas y de asuntos civiles dentro de la comunidad, entre ellos, por ejemplo, la construcción de un nuevo camino o de una escuela, como de funciones religiosas, de entre las cuales la más importante radica en asegurar la armonía de la comunidad, la armonía de la comunidad con la naturaleza y pedir a los santos patronos que eso ocurra. Así, el fundamento de la autoridad civil se encuentra en el mundo divino, creencia que no sería aceptable por el gobierno mexicano sin su síntesis con las funciones jurídico-políticas que se han comentado. El emplazamiento de estos cargos civiles juega un papel muy importante en diversos festivales religiosos en honor a los santos patronos, la Virgen María, San Juan y Santa Ana. Bueno, a lo que iríamos es a esto, una celtalización de la cultura occidental, en donde las prácticas religiosas están entretejidas con la actividad política. El proceso que llamamos celtalización, I don't know if it is correct, celtalization. El proceso que llamamos celtalización de la cultura católica occidental puede considerarse una cuestión de equilibrio con las demandas del Estado secular, que por su parte, con la mira de una tolerancia liberal hacia las creencias de los ciudadanos, permite estas reinterpretaciones creativas, reinterpretaciones en las que se ve fortalecida la cosmovisión de las comunidades. En conclusión, podemos decir, volviendo a nuestro argumento inicial, que el caso de prácticas interculturales religiosas de los celtales nos da una perspectiva específica del problema general del enfrentamiento entre múltiples creencias religiosas que está ocurriendo hoy día y la secularización como posición de no creencia políticamente admitida. Mi sugerencia final consiste en decir que este modo de integración de las creencias religiosas con las acciones políticas en el pueblo celtal pudiera quizás ser tomada como un modelo en lo que concierne a casos similares, casos de confrontación entre estos dos fenómenos, o visto de esta manera, intercultural religiosity in the horizon. Muchas gracias.
You know, I think we should reconvene the community table so that we can. Thank you very much. That was good. Yeah, that was very harmonious, I think. And the questions you can ask him either if you want in Spanish or English. And I have a question. And I think this morning, Mexicans can be considered the sectarians in this country. So I'm very glad to be here in front of this NAFTA group because in spite that the NAFTA was an economic phenomenon, it is true that has affected the rest of the lives of people in these three countries, including Mexico, for good and for bad. But just trying to put together all these ideas about multiculturality, acceptance, that you explained from Taylor, I would like to ask you if you see this NAFTA translated into only the shift of merchandises to the free trade of people between these three countries. I mean, speaking about this recognition and reconciliation of different cultures based in a religion or a common belief, how do you see an immigration reform between our three countries? Because also Canada has closed the borders to the third part. Yes.
Wow. Any comments on that? For a second. Great question.
And just to make it even more pointed, before we had our lecture this morning, just about a year ago, Senator Durbin gave a very rousing speech in favor of the Dream Act.
The Dream Act.
Yeah. Just an idea. I think these immigration reforms should have to take into account an ethical and hermeneutical point of view. I think this is what Charles Taylor defended, but I don't know.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that much of what he's doing militates toward, I almost want to say open borders, even though he does defend a certain value of nationality or nationalism, I guess. And certainly he would recognize that certainly U.S. American culture has always been a culture of integration, of immigration. I think the same goes for Canada. And his principle from the Taylor Bouchard book that we shouldn't expect to be able to preserve some kind of American identity over against these aliens should hold. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot there. I need to think about that question.
Yeah. You and then this question. But I think she was asking
Just a really little thing, which is, I think what your question highlights that I think Taylor does really well, is he recognizes that almost all of us sort of experience actually a problem of multiple identities. And I think that question of immigration reform and why Taylor excites us in this kind of crisis time is because he actually names the cultural messiness. And so, like my parents were immigrants. And what does that mean in the lived experience of trying to be Chinese and be Canadian? It's an ongoing negotiation. Like I remember, especially as a child, and maybe I'm telling too much here, but I think I grew up at school understanding much more principles of democracy than my father, who was raised in China, understood. Like there's a very clear hierarchical and sort of obedience has a different texture and a different resonance in Chinese culture. Maybe I was just a bad kid, but I do think though that sense of in families of immigrants needing to constantly actually negotiate it is really a practical reasoning kind of thing. And so what happens, like there's so many, I'm not equipped to answer the legal issue, but even at the cultural level, the level of family, it comes up.
I just want to make one more quick comment, and it's about the language piece. Taylor pushes hard the idea that Canadians, or anyone else for that matter, should be able to have a main language, but it shouldn't be the official language. It should be the language of the community, and that means that people should be open to, people should be bilingual, try to be bilingual, something that we don't do much in this country. And I think it's a great idea, it's a great model to have this kind of presentation today where we're moving among languages. In a way, it's modeling the kind of thing that he thinks that we should be doing more of. The other side of this whole picture, though, with the NAFTA ideas, is the kind of the commodification of cultures that goes on. That's a great homogenizing force, really, but in many ways effaces cultural differences.
I don't want to preempt anything, but I think part of my question relates to your in Chiapas, the communities are highly fragmented, even among the Saltanos. So I think Mauri's book was written in the 70s, and something like that. And now what we have is a situation where NAFTA is in play. You have the post-Zapatista uprising that was in some respect a response to the homogenization that NAFTA brings and the marginalization of entire segments of Mexican peasantry. So I think one of the things that I would wonder about in terms of what Esther raised is when Taylor talks about this kind of ability to maintain multiplicity and be able to talk across borders, we have the other phenomenon of this total, what would I say, kind of erasure of borders as a result of NAFTA. Economically. Now this has certainly happened in Chiapas with the indigenous that I have worked with. I believe that their ability to sell coffee is affected by global coffee prices. It is the only cash crop many of them have. Their value of their land is determined a lot by all kinds of, cattle growers coming in or different forces from outside, so to speak. So it's kind of, to me, the real challenge is to try to bring Taylor's vision into play with economic questions, with globalization, so to speak. And that I would like to hear you more talk about globalization and how Taylor deals with that.
I think that's one of the areas where he's not at his strongest. And that's what this research group that I've been working with has found, both that the ways in which, as I said, globalization produces very powerful homogenizing economic forces, and at the same time ways in which, this is something of a countervailing force, nation-state structures and nationalism have pervaded even ecclesiologies, have informed religious communities. These two dynamics are ones that I don't know, I think Taylor hasn't kind of fully faced up to. So that is what we're working on. I have a quick question for you, Pablo, if I could. It was about in your paper the vice versa that you introduced in this process of self-realization. Sure, that the self-thoughts have adapted in certain ways. You seem to suggest here, though, that public demands have been adjusted to religious practices. I'm sorry, I can't translate that back in Spanish, but in what ways has the state or the public authorities adapted to the self-thoughts? What's the other story, or have they?
Yes, well, the public authorities in this zone, Bachajón, are not so demanding over the indigenous groups.
They give them more room.
Yes, and this allows to them to make this kind of mixes. For example, in the festivals. So the secular state is altogether a pressure, but in general terms. But in some regions, the indigenous groups have more freedom.
I just wanted to ask about, and I think this speaks somewhat to both of these questions, because I think that being a communitarian in a globalized society is enormously complicated, but I think a part of not only the intercultural dialogue, which Taylor emphasizes so much, that there should also be an intracultural dialogue with a view towards establishing the shared good within a particular community. And I think the concept of the shared good is one that could have possibly be understated as a touchstone of communitarianism, especially the ethics. And that was a concept that I noticed was entirely absent from the articulations we heard of Taylor today, and I think is maybe a little bit understated in the works of his that I've read. So I wonder if any of you could sort of speak to that absence of the articulation of the shared good as such.
Well, I wrote another version of this paper, actually, which started with an articulation of the way Taylor has a fundamental belief in reconciliation and unity. And some of the way he methodologically proceeds to do this is to always point out that common good. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think it's true. And he has a way of framing discourse that says, look, here's two kinds of liberals. But hey, neither of them want homogenization. And both of them affirm diversity, in fact, and he has a way of doing that with people who are discoursing adversarially about life issues, for example, in the moral sphere, and he does that again in the secular age. So getting more precisely to what you were saying about the intracultural, I just want to link this up with something that I think, Pablo, your presentation highlighted very well, which is within a culture. Like, we've tended somewhat to frame the discourse here when we say intercultural as a mapping onto globality, really, and the fact that it's across all these different countries in the world. But within a culture, there is discourse that is, I don't want to say agonistic, but there's a tension between, for example, liberalism and Christianity. And so even that, I think, that Pablo's presentation highlights in the situation of this particular community in Mexico, does, I think, actually highlight the fact that it can be intracultural, or at least within a particular nation. That there's, I mean, maybe your question points at the fact that what are even the boundaries of the culture? That already is not easy to map.
Also, something Pablo's talk highlighted nicely is the difference between, often we talk about intercultural, talking about immigration, but in the case of Mexico, it's fascinating. And also, unfortunately, in the U.S., we don't talk about it nearly as much, but in our immigrants, but also in a conquered group. And that's the problem. And a lot of what you were saying, I was thinking about how it's just a secular age, but under the Spaniards, which is the Catholic Empire, they were developing the same resilience against being crushed in that sort of group. So
I'm not supposed to talk about Canada, but no, that's, I mean, the twin issues that Taylor's always struggling when he talks about this in connection to Canada is, on the one hand, immigrants, including Muslims, but on the other hand, the New York peoples, the first people, the native peoples there. He leaves that he had to leave those out of the report that I was talking about. Let's come back to your point briefly. The common good is definitely there, and that's really maybe the most Catholic thing about Taylor as a political theorist. But you have had to kind of read between the lines, I think, in a lot of his early work, because he wasn't so committed to kind of making those commitments explicit. And that does have the result, as you say, that he doesn't really get very far into the process of determining, negotiating the common good. I think it's a good observation.
I don't know how we're doing it, because I know we've only had still a 30, so people go to talk. So if we could talk a lot. Thank you very much.